Life Management Science Labs would like to acknowledge that we live and produce this podcast on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people. We'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands of our listeners and our international colleagues. We'd like to pay our respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. Hey everyone, and welcome to All Together, the Family Science Insights podcast, produced by L the Life Management Science Labs. We are champions of life management science, providing structured insights informed by science and inspired by practice on key aspects of conscious living. Each week we bring you scientific and practical insights on each element, with the expert knowledge of professionals in the field. I'm your host, Dina Sargeant. Let's get started. Hey guys, and welcome back to another episode. Now, we all know that we need family in our lives to support us, no matter what version of family is yours. Today, we're looking into the bond between family and how to keep extended members of the family involved, while also asserting some boundaries when needed. We're joined today by Associate Professor Sylvia Mikucki-Enyart, PhD. With her expertise in interpersonal and family communication, her fields of study are quite interesting, which includes in-law communication and adult children managing the situation of late life parental divorce. She is also an editor of the Journal of Family Communication. So thank you so much for joining me, Sylvia.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Now, there is a really great scopes of research, and it's very relatable, especially to me, of how sort of dealing with and so many different aspects of that in both sides, especially when it comes to the late life parental divorce in my family that's recently come in. So how did you find an interest in family communication?
Yeah, I remember my undergrad in college. I was originally a mass communication major and I wanted to be a journalist. And then as one of the required courses in in my department, you had to take an interpersonal communication course. And I just found it so fascinating, that there was these like theories and people actually studied relationships and like what you can do to make them better. And so I was really interested in it. And then, that course alone led me to change my major. And then I just really enjoyed it. And I had a lot of professors, suggesting I go on to get, my master's and my PhD. And at the time, I was also a creative writing minor, though. So I was debating between going the communication path or getting an MFA in poetry. So a little bit different.
Mhm.
But then, I took time off and then I worked for a couple years and I just realized I really missed that kind of research component. And just like what a cool job to get to have questions about relationships and answer them. And then also teaching about that. And that's something that even today is like so rewarding in the classes that I teach. Students after they leave the class, emailing me like that's something they used in our class or how that, my classes made them realize maybe they were in a dysfunctional relationship, and ended it. And so it's been really fun with that. And then my research interest itself or somewhat personal, a little bit kind of like you were saying, figuring out boundaries and everything with our own extended families. And so with my partner, once we started dating, my relationship with his mom, who's now my mother-in-law, was not how I thought it would go.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm a nerd. And so I was like, oh, what does the research have to say about this? And I realized that there wasn't tons actually. And so I found a really interesting space in there to try to help us understand what's going on with in-law relationships and how can we make them better.
Yeah, because I think the in-law idea gets a really bad rep as well. You're sort of just like, oh, okay, you expect them to be really bad, or you hear all these horror stories about, especially when it comes to the daughter, like a girl coming into the family, where it's like there's so much of a mama's boy kind of a trope attached to it, and it gets such a bad representation. And I think since that you mentioned it, I was looking into some of the articles that you've written as well when it comes to the toxic mother-in-law trope and things like that. And that idea it's so really like a fairy tale kind of idea where it's like the wicked stepmother kind of trope attached to it. because you just sort of expect it to go badly. But in reality, there are some situations, most situations, where they do get along or there is positive connotations between them.
Yeah, 100%. And like that was, even though my interest in in-laws started from kind of a personal perspective, it was never about like researching stuff that would impact my relationship or yeah, like looking for a negative thing. It was just like, what goes on that makes these complicated? And I've come to find out a lot of things,
Mhm.
but you're right. The negative stereotypes, especially with mothers-in-laws and daughters-in-law, is something that I'm really trying to push against. I'm working on a book project that is kind of rooted in more of like a feminist stance against this because it really, there's a lot of gendered kind of scripts and expectations and roles that are, playing into this. And then, yeah, when you go into an in law relationship with a negative expectation, it becomes a self fulfilling prophecy, right? So I'm
Mhm.
already thinking this is going to be crummy to start with. So if that's my like lens, those are the glasses that I'm wearing to view this relationship, anything that person does, whether it's the mother in law or daughter in law, and it can be the most innocuous behavior, is going to then be interpreted through that negative lens, and then it's like, oh,
Yeah.
see, I knew she was going to be like that. And then we respond to people based on this expectation that we have. And so a lot of folks go into this with a really negative, yeah, kind of expectation of what it should be. But like you said, most people actually have good relationships with their in laws. I mean, in my studies, the majority of people on a 7-point scale, 7 being very satisfied, are scoring in like 5.6 or above
Wow.
in their satisfaction level with their in laws. So it's like something's not adding up. And I mean, yes, these are convenience samples. And I do have outliers. I have folks that are like, 1.0 on that scale all the way to
Mhm.
sevens. But something that, I just recently started like dabbling in social media, like posting stuff on, an Instagram account and TikTok about in laws.
Mhm.
And I noticed, there's a lot of people in this space, none of which have credentials to be, besides their experiences, which is a fine thing.
Yeah.
But it's so negative, all the stuff that's out there and just kind of, keeps repeating this. And so that's just the message you get, that my mother-in-law is going to be toxic, that my daughter-in-law is stealing my son, when it's none of that, but that's the message we get, in our culture.
Yeah.
And it could have really damaging effects on the relationship too. So
Yes. Yeah. And I think we're definitely going to go really deep into that when it comes to extended families and in-law extended families. I think it's a great conversation that we're looking forward to having today because there's so much that we need to unpack throughout a lot of it. But before we get started, I love to get to know some of your recommendations as well as some of your interests by hopefully sort of relaxing us a little bit before we get into the harder hitting questions. So to start off with, do you have a favorite book that you could share with us?
I think picking one favorite would be impossible, but two books that I've read
Mm.
recently that are really amazing are We Can Make This Place Beautiful by Maggie Smith. And then most recently, This American Ex-Wife by Liz Lenz. And they're really cool. They're both memoirs, very different writing styles, kind of looking actually at divorce and marriage and just kind of even the whole cultural and social structure of it. So they're very good. I recommend reading them.
Okay, I'm going to make a list of that. I always make lists when it comes to every book that sort of comes onto the show
Yeah.
because everyone always sounds like it intrigues me so much that now my Goodreads account is like, I have to have a whole little shelf area just for the books that get recommended on the show to me.
Yeah.
So, how about movies? Do you have a movie that you've enjoyed recently?
Oh, well, I did enjoy Barbie a lot. But I think a favorite of mine is Eternal Sunshine for the Spotless Mind, which I think was like celebrating its 20th anniversary this year.
Wow.
Which yeah, makes me feel really old. Uh, but yeah, it's a great movie.
Now that sounds great. So what about that movie is really your favorite?
I think it's just a really beautiful movie. Again, it's kind of based on relationships,
Mhm.
and what happens when we're kind of in bad ones and the good parts of relationships and bad parts of relationships. And yeah, and I think at the time in my life when it came out, it was like just kind of checking all the boxes of like what was happening in life. So it was, yeah, it's a very, I feel, yeah, emotionally charged movie. So if you need like a good cry, it's a good movie.
Oh, I'm adding that to my list then.
Yeah.
How about podcast? Do you have a podcast that you could recommend to us?
I'm a big fan of Conan O'Brien Needs a Friend.
Okay.
I think my favorite part of that is like when him and like his co-host or his guests are just like laughing, because I love, like, laughter is contagious, and I just love hearing other people like laugh and having a good time. But yeah, that's one of my faves.
Yeah, it kind of gets awkward when you're sitting on the train though, and suddenly someone starts laughing, and then you'll start laughing along with them, and then you're just like laughing to yourself. But I totally get you when it comes to laughing is contagious, and that show is a very great example of how to brighten up your day at any moment. Now, do you have a role model? It could be famous or non-famous, either in your professional, personal life that you really find yourself looking up to.
Yeah, I'm gonna say no. I don't know, not really. Yeah, no one famous. And yeah, I guess, I don't know. Yeah, I don't think I've ever really had someone that I really look up to tons, like try to like emulate or do things like, I mean, there's bits and pieces, of course, of folks from throughout my life that I'm like, oh, that's a nice thing that they do. It's like, good to be that kind of person.
Yeah.
But I wouldn't say a role model, no.
So certain traits that you pick and choose of different people.
Maybe, or yeah, just like ways that they interact with other people that you're like, oh, that's a nice way to be. But
So collect
other
them
than
all,
that,
that would be a role model, I guess.
maybe, yeah.
Yeah. Well, I hope you're all warmed up and hopefully ready for the harder questions that we're going to be asking today. Now, I know that everyone has a very different definition as to what family is to them. Either professionally or personally, how would you go ahead and define what a family is?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. And it's funny because I always act in my family communication courses for undergrads. It's like one of our first activities. It's like, well, how do you define family? And at first they're like, that's easy. But then when you kind of push on it, it's a lot harder to have like a definition of that. And for me, I think that there's kind of like two camps I fall into with family. Like, what is family? Like, one, I think there is, an obvious kind of biological notion of family,
Mhm.
but just having biological ties to somebody, in my opinion, does not make you like family. It's like,
Yeah.
yes, you're maybe related, but I mean, obviously, there's a lot of organizations and, government or other things that, really rely on just like this biological definition. For me, that's a component, but it's not like a necessary component. For
Mhm.
me, then family are, is one other person or a group of people who's giving you emotional, psychological, instrumental support, that place where you feel supported, that you could be yourself, take any mask off that you have, that you're
Mhm.
accepted for who you are, and folks that really have your best interests, at heart. And there's nothing transactional. It's like a place to just be, with folks. And so
Yeah.
I think having kind of, for me, I have a broader definition, and just personally too, of like how my family is kind of, represented, is something that isn't, rooted in biology. Like, I have folks who are biological family who I don't consider family, and don't have a relationship with, and folks that I'm not biologically related to, but who are, my family. So,
Mhm. So it's more like the characteristics that sort of make up a family. It's not necessarily the fact that you're blood related to them or that you're related to them by name. There's that idea of, okay, I get along with you to a point where I consider you a family.
yeah. Yeah. I think definitely those kind of more social and emotional aspects, but that presents challenges too, right?
Yeah.
Because say someone's in the hospital, and you're just like, well, yeah, we have no biological or legal relationship, but they're my family, a hospital might not recognize that, and you can't either go visit or, decision making in certain like emergency cases. And so I think it's I don't think there's an agreed upon universal definition of family, which I think is good because that allows everybody the opportunity to kind of create what family is for them.
Hmm.
But it's not without challenges too. So it's kind of just, yeah, it's like I don't know, it's like a sticky kind of situation where
Yeah.
you want to say families, whatever I make of it, but then you could run into some real problems, with that too.
Yeah.
So,
So it's the legalities that sort of come into place quite a bit regarding family.
right. Yeah. And like, in that then just kind of, I think, speaks to a lot of cultures privileging the biological nature of family,
Yeah.
because that's just like the default. And so, like, it wouldn't, it doesn't matter if you haven't talked to that person in 20 years, but if they're your, biological something, then their, decision making or preferences or whatever would, supersede someone that is like your family and has known you for 20 years, but they're not biological, or maybe you don't have any kind of legal recognition like adoption or, marriage or something like that, but they're still family to you.
Hmm. Yeah, that definitely does come up as a problem probably quite often with a lot of people. Now, do you think that family still has such an importance as it has done in since like decades ago, or has it really evolved into something deeper than what a family is?
Yeah, I think it really kind of, well, I don't know. I want to say it kind of depends, but also it doesn't.
Mhm.
Um, I think certain cultures, the family is the center of everything, and for some cultures, that is just like biological and legal family. I think when we look especially at more like marginalized identities, like LGBTQ folks, like family, and that's kind of a chosen family is crucial to, well being, to acceptance. And I think we still have a big, like, our family is still important. I mean, I think the last statistic I read was like globally about 38% of folks worldwide live in kind of multi generational, or extended family households.
Mhm.
So it's not like it's not a big thing to us anymore. So I think it is really still pivotal, but I do think in some situations we're seeing kind of an evolution of what that is and who's included
Mhm.
in that family, that it's not as limited anymore. And folks are kind of realizing, I mean, we're seeing, birth rates go down and marriage rates go down, that like I don't have to have this quote unquote traditional kind of family
Yeah.
to have a family. But I think whatever family folks have serves just hugely important functions, for them.
So now looking into extended families, how necessary are they in building a relationship and how important are they in sort of having those personal ties to them? Because personally, for me, I don't see a lot of my extended family as family. I see them as people that I'm related to, but not family. Mainly because I don't speak to them as often, or what if I do, there's a lot of formalities involved in it. So, are they really necessary in sort of building that family connection that I think we're ingrained to sort of have in this day and age?
I don't think it's like a necessity. Like if you don't have strong extended family ties, you're going to like fail as a person or you're not going to be like well-rounded or have an understanding and a sense of connection and community.
Mhm.
I think it matters in the fact is if you want that, right?
Yeah.
And I think a really important thing to kind of frame this whole conversation is too, when I'm talking about like extended family or, ways to kind of have better relationships, this is like with seemingly functional and healthy dynamics,
Mhm.
because this stuff isn't saying like if you have an abusive or toxic family member, do this one little trick and that will help. Sometimes the best way to kind of manage these things is to not have a relationship with folks, and so I think it's important that this isn't saying like you need to do, whatever you can to have that connection because not all extended family relationships are created equal, right?
Mhm.
So I don't think there are definitely benefits. There's a lot of benefits of extended family relationships, but it doesn't mean you can't have a fulfilling family life without them. Like we know the role of grandparents, aunts and uncles, those do play big roles in the family system. But if you don't have a close, grandparent grandchild relationship, it's not like, it's all doom and gloom. They can be really, I guess I like to think of it as like nice, fun additions, right? It's like
Yeah.
if you have a good relationship with extended family, that's a nice bonus,
Okay.
to whatever kind of maybe nuclear unit you have with a partner, or if, you and a partner had children, it's a nice bonus, but it's not a necessity. You can have a wonderful dynamic without them. But it is interesting because, like, we don't have tons of extended family, and all of our family lives out of state because, as an academic, you just kind of move where the job is.
Yep.
And I will say, like, there are twinges, though, I have of kind of envy when I see like grandparents, at events for, at my child's school and stuff, or people are like, oh, yeah, my, in laws took the kids for the weekend. And it's like, oh, that would be nice to have a little bit of a break.
Yeah.
But so I think, they're important, but it's not like an end all be all, but it can be a nice addition for sure.
So there's that kind of idea like FOMO that sort of hits when it's sort of comparing it to other families as well. Like particularly for me, a lot of my family, extended family, lives in either New Zealand or Malaysia. There's barely anyone that lives here, and if so, we're very distantly related to them. So, but the two ways of that they, especially as grandparents, present themselves to us, one is a little bit more lenient where you can sort of tell them everything. One has very a formal sense to them. And when it comes to boundaries and setting boundaries, I'm a lot more relaxed when it comes to what my parents tell one side of the grandparents about my life and what's going on with me. But when it comes to the others, I have recently found myself really sitting my parents down and being like, okay, if there's anything that they're asking about me, don't mention these few things because there's a lot of boundaries that I feel like I have to set with them. Otherwise, it gets criticized and put back on me, which is the last thing I sort of want to be dealing with. So I've had this conversation with a couple of my friends as well. And a lot of them are saying that that's probably not a great thing to do, mainly because I think there's that respectful responsibility that sort of comes into it of like they're your grandparents. You should be sort of allowing them to know more about your life. And they only know what I want them to know. So barely anything, pretty much. So how is that? Is that a good way of sort of setting that boundary? Or is there another way that you could recommend that is just a little bit more lenient?
Well, I mean, I think if you don't want a more lenient or kind of sometimes what we call like permeable
Mhm.
boundary, that's okay, first of all, right? And
Yep.
I think, one of the things too is like, if we don't have closeness to begin with, it's really hard to want to share and be open, with other people. Or there are some folks who just, yes, because they're family, like we don't feel like they fully understand us or accept us, or whatever that is. And so I think it's perfectly okay to set those boundaries. And what the example you gave too is just like a perfect example of kind of the complexity of extended family relationships and setting boundaries. Cause it's like, it's not just you who has to set a boundary with them. It's like then this third party, but not really a third party, but your parents,
Yeah.
and like what they can share or not. And I do think sometimes that gets tricky because, like, what if they just want to share about their child to their own parents? And like, that's the one thing too, right? When we're talking about these extended family relationships, they're multi-layered relationships, so like your grandparent isn't just your grandparent. They're the parent, to your parent. They're an
Yeah.
in-law to, your other parent. And then that gets a lot of layers of things that make it kind of really tricky with boundary setting, and just different relational closeness. I don't know what your parents' relationship is with their respective parents, but like, if your parents aren't close to your grandparents or they're closer to one side, which, we often does happen too, it's where you tend to be closer to those grandparents or those, aunts and uncles and stuff than the side that, the adult parent or the parent, isn't as close to. And so a lot of times, you have someone kind of mediating these relationships, for you.
Mhm.
Um, but I think, yeah, it's perfectly acceptable. I don't think no one is owed anything from you or information about you
Yeah.
simply on the fact that we're related. And I think sometimes this notion of family gets abused a little bit. Oh, they're family, just do this for them. Oh, they're family, just tell them this. It's like you kind of see how this can get taken advantage of when we see the word or the notion of family often evoked in like organizational settings and companies, like, oh, we're a family. And so they're trying to play on that idea, right? So we're family, so just work a little bit later. We're family, just do this. And sometimes with that, like, our boundaries aren't respected because someone's family. And I think that can be really problematic. But there's a lot of cultural and social pressure with regards to like what families are kind of owed,
Mhm.
um, or, should be kind of looped in on.
Yeah. So it's kind of like it feels like it's my responsibility towards my grandparents to be respectful and to open up and share a lot. There are a lot of conversations that I have with them, especially where I'm just like, oh, I don't have an answer for that. Like I haven't told them that I'm in a relationship, haven't mentioned those stuff because I know the kind of expectations that can come along with that and the kind of plans that they would have. And because like I know that that's the possibility of the conversation going one way, I sort of cut it right at the tip of the trunk before it even goes any further than that.
Yeah, and I think that's acceptable. I mean, I think there's cultural divides, there's generational divides that doesn't matter. Our grandparents just might not understand something.
Mhm.
They can love us, to death, but they're just not going to understand or maybe accept something. And I think it's okay to kind of have that self-preservation, of keeping some things for yourself or yeah, changing the topic and things that you don't want to share.
Mhm.
Because if it's something that's going to cause you more stress or heartache or pressure, it's like, yeah, why do it? You don't have to do that.
Mhm. It's really strange as well because you're also mentioning about the multi-generational layers that sort of get involved. I did not actually recognize that until you mentioned it. Because the family ties to that are so extensive. Like, if my uncle, it's not just my uncle, it's my dad's brother. There's so many relations that you don't even recognize. And, my dad is very comfortable telling them everything that's going on in his life. And then when it comes to me and my sister, especially, both of us are sort of just like, okay, if there's anything that you want to mention of us, hand the phone over to us and we'll say it because there's so many times where he sort of said everything that was going on with us and then suddenly come back to bite us on the butt later on.
Yeah. And I mean, I think it's so interesting too, because I think like, even just hearing like students' examples and research stuff, it's like there's so much boundary management. So there's this one theory, privacy management theory. And it looks at, yeah, we have these internal boundaries, and that's usually within a family system, but we have a lot of them, so like you and your sister and your dad, your nuclear family, like you might have one boundary around that. And maybe within that boundary, you all chat a lot, you're sharing information freely, letting them know what's going on in your life. And then maybe then then there's this boundary with your family and grandparents, but then your dad has a separate boundary, right?
Yep.
Within that boundary, and maybe that one's super open, he's happy to tell him what's going on in his life. But then the boundary with you all and grandparents and dad, that's a different boundary. And so it's a lot, to manage. And yeah, it's just a lot to manage for family members. But I think it's great, yeah, that your dad respects that,
Mhm.
and, acknowledges what your boundaries are, respects them and enacts them and upholds them,
Mhm.
which is something that not all families do.
Are there different sort of dynamics that can get involved depending on gender as well? Say, for example, the son and the parents or the daughter and the parents. Are there different sort of communications that can occur between the both?
Yeah. And it's more, there are, but I'm always really careful talking about gendered kind of patterns that we see because they're all based on socialization, right?
Yeah.
There is nothing inherent that makes a male or female communicate differently with their parents. It's all how we're socialized. So there's this adage, a daughter's a daughter all her life, a son's a son till he takes a wife. So even in just that adage, right?
Yeah.
We're already gendering that our daughter's always going to, be in our lives, be in our relationship, but the son's family are in our lives more until that old pesky daughter-in-law comes and steals them and rips them away from us.
Yeah.
And so it really is just the socialization of it. Oftentimes men are not socialized to share as much, to be as emotionally expressive. And
Mhm.
then especially if it's an opposite sex couple, if they get married, suddenly now all this kin keeping is on like the daughter-in-law's plate. She's the one responsible for making plans, not only with her own family of origin, but now her husband's family, and sending the thank you notes or the pictures of the kids or, this or that.
Mhm.
And so then we kind of just fall into these patterns. And what I see too then is if a daughter-in-law and mother-in-law have a contentious relationship, this kind of becomes, where the expectations and self-fulfilling prophecy thing happens again, that the daughter-in-law, if I'm charged with making all the plans with my husband's family,
Yeah.
but my mother-in-law and I don't get along, I'm not going to make those plans with his family, as much anymore.
Mhm.
And if he's not going to take the initiative, well, then the mother-in-law could is justified then in thinking, well, I don't see him much anymore. He doesn't call as much anymore. It's because of her, when it should be, the son's responsibility
Yeah.
to do it.
Yeah.
And so I do think we do see that because of this expectation that a wife is supposed to be the one doing all this emotional labor in the family. So oftentimes we do see a reduction in contact with the paternal side of the family. A lot of folks tend to be closer to their maternal side, the family, because if the wife has a good relationship with her family, that's who she's going to be making plans with,
Yeah.
not the other side. And it should be the husband who then is going to, take that initiative and make the plans if he wants to maintain ties with his extended family. But then, of course, it gets, perceived as it's the daughter-in-law's fault and she doesn't want him to be in
Yeah.
touch with his family. So,
Yeah. And I think one of the other things, and I think we did speak about this just before we started recording, is the idea of meeting your partner's extended family. And that is a very recent, a very real situation for me to be in. I'm currently going through the mental prep of meeting 18 different family members of his extended family. And just the idea that I come from a very small nuclear family, and all of my family is just the sum of 4 people that live in the same area. And the idea of meeting the extended family of that is a huge dynamic shift into what my communication role would be with them as well. It's like, what kind of relationship should I build that's okay, it's his family, but at the same time, that's going to be my family, or it's going to be considered my family too. So, what kind of expectations sort of come along when it comes to meeting sort of the extended family members?
yeah, I think there's kind of a couple ways that expectations kind of color this whole experience. Like, first, I think it's important to understand that, a family is its own culture, right? And it's like you're maybe going into a different country, especially like from 18 people, from 4 people to 18 people. And so families have, different ways of expressing emotions,
Mhm.
sharing information, humor, on topics that are or aren't acceptable to talk
Mhm.
about. Sometimes our partners kind of explicitly prep us for this.
Mhm.
You'll be going to an event and they're like, hey, okay, don't talk to Uncle so and so about this or that. Aunt
Yeah.
so and so is going to say this thing. And we just kind of ignore her. Other times, we learn what these kind of rules are in these family systems
Yeah.
by just kind of stepping in it. Like you see something that's like record scratches, and you're like, oh, I guess we don't talk about this, in this family.
Mhm.
Um, then I think sometimes there's this pressure to be accepted as immediate family, which,
Mhm.
it's like, yes, of course, we all want people to love us and be like, oh my gosh, you're the best thing that's ever happened in this family. And we're so glad, they found you and you're the best addition ever.
Yeah.
But it also takes time, right? Because you have to build trust with these people. Just because you're, partnering with somebody and going to, have a family with them, and be brought into their family, it doesn't mean that like all of a sudden we kind of gain this total instant family right off the bat, and I think sometimes those expectations are different for different members of the family. And that's the one thing too. And like any kind of in-law, so whether it's a grandparent-in-law, aunt-in-law, cousin-in-law, parent-in-law, like any of these
Yep.
extended crossover, families, relationships, we don't talk about it. Like when we're getting ready to like marry somebody or we're going to be in a long-term partnership, we have kind of more of these cultural scripts of like what this relationship looks like, even though those are also limiting, right? And your relationship could look like whatever you want it to be. But like,
Yep.
we know that it's like important to have conversations as romantic partners, and talk about things. But like, when it comes to the other person's extended family or our in-laws, we don't have those scripts, I mean, for the longest time, I would just start talking if my mother-in-law was in the room because I didn't know what I should call her. I didn't know if I should call her first name, Mrs. So-and-so. And like, so I would just be like, I really hope she knows this message is for her. And then once we had a kid, it was a lot easier to be like, oh, grandma this or grandma, what do you think, about this? But it's
Yeah.
like, we don't have these conversations. And that makes it, I think, really tricky too, of like, what do you expect from me as a family member entering? What can I expect from you? Like, what boundaries do you want to have and stuff? And so I think not having those conversations, and we can't have them, but then they're often mediated by our partner. So,
Yep. Especially because they're all very close. And with my family, because it's the four of us, we're able to just go off and do our own thing without really, notifying the other or sort of the whole family coming together. So it's that idea of not only am I really having to go into a whole new family, I'm also having to figure out what boundary I set with them as well. Because I don't want to be the go-to call for like if they can't get in contact with him, then they contact me. So it's kind of that like, okay, do I set the boundary straight off the bat, or do I like I think I'm sort of scared, and I have been overthinking this for quite a bit with that idea of like, okay, how much am I going to share about myself when I first meet them? How much am I going to say? So what are some sort of go-to tips you could possibly recommend in a way that sort of allows a person, not just me, but like a person who's listening to this also, to sort of be like, okay, I'm going to meet the in-laws, I'm going to meet the extended family. These are some things that I can let them know straight off the bat, or that I can sort of allow to open up to get them to know me a little bit more without really being so deep in myself where I have to overthink it.
yeah, well, I think one of former professor had once told me when I was transitioning just to like a new PhD program, the advice they gave me was that we have 2 eyes, 2 ears, and 1 mouth for a reason. So the power of like observation when you enter this kind of new setting. Now, that's not saying like just stand, against the wall taking notes, like, being creepy and not talking at
Yeah.
all. But, kind of observing what topics do they talk about a lot? How do they joke? Like sense of humor, I feel is kind of like a big one and can go well or like, like I'm a very sarcastic person. One of my husband's uncles is super sarcastic and we, can barb each other and get along great. I could not do that same thing, with other members of his extended family. And so I think, observing, kind of seeing, what topics are talked about, even like listening to stories that they tell, you can kind of get a sense of like what values are important. A lot of times we use storytelling as a way to even socialize newcomers into a family system. If all the stories are always about like family members coming in to help one another, and supporting each other and being there for one another, it's like, oh, okay, they're kind of trying to cue me in. So like, this is kind of an expectation, we have of you. I think it depends too, like what, first meetings, I think just kind of those superficial topics are good, I mean, we always can have the weather, right? What's going on we probably want to stay away from what's going on in the world sometimes, right? Because those topics can be too controversial.
Start a fire right there.
Yeah. Yeah. So don't listen to that part of advice. But yeah, I think, and I think that's the thing, it's going to slowly evolve. You can't have this kind of make or break. I mean, although first impressions, right, are important, but I think
Yeah.
just being open, being kind, and then it will evolve. And then folks and their partners can start to figure out for themselves, like what kind of boundaries and we as a unit want to set with the extended family. Because
Yeah.
just because they're all super close and maybe they share tons of private information doesn't mean that you have to do that either. And a partner, it's a negotiation, because then
Hmm.
a partner has to realize, yeah, I'm with someone else who has a different background, has different expectations, and those are my priority now.
Hmm.
Even, I mean, you still can love your extended family, be there for them, but now your priority is this partner of yours. And if something makes them really uncomfortable that you do with your extended family or an expectation of them, then that's going to need modification. The person entering a family, you shouldn't just be expected to like, well, this is just how it's done. So you got to roll with it. But we also can't expect the extended family to completely change either. So it really is kind of this delicate dance of figuring out our needs. And a lot of times you're not going to figure that out until there's some kind of mess up, till there's a conflict. There's a
Yeah.
point where we butt heads or, you told your partner something you didn't think to say, don't tell your family. And then at the next family gathering, they're like, hey, how do you know that job interview go? And you're like, I don't, how do they know this? And your partner might think,
Yeah.
I don't know. I tell my family everything. That's a moment that we're going to have to clarify kind of expectations and boundaries. So sometimes it's just trial by fire.
Yeah. Just have to wait for that incident to happen and
Yeah.
occur before we sort of realize, okay, don't do that.
Yeah. And sometimes, like partner, you sometimes, again, if we think of family as a culture, we're sometimes not even aware of like our culture, right?
Yeah.
Whether that's a, ethnic racial culture or a family culture until someone points something out to us, and then we're like, oh, yeah, I could see how that can make you uncomfortable if you didn't grow up like this, or,
Yeah.
oh, I understand where you're coming from. And so it is just a learning curve. It's not going to all go smoothly. And I think just, yeah, having open communication, especially with your partner, is really important.
Yeah. No, I think he's definitely telling me that I'm overthinking quite a bit. With the idea of meeting like 4 times the amount of my normal family.
And if it's all at once, that is overwhelming. That would be a lot.
Yeah, yeah. Because they're very close. They hang out pretty much every weekend. They have like a barbecue on a Sunday, and I'm just like, I'm looking forward to the day that I have to stand there and basically turn into a wallflower and just try to understand how everyone goes. Because I know everyone has different ways of communicating. And, I'm sure that they'll be okay. But I think for me, I'm very, very closed off at first. So I always refer to him as a golden retriever to the black cat that I am. So it's very much that dynamic, which is like, I think, opening up a little bit more and figuring that out, especially as we sort of get further into the relationship, which I think is really great to sort of, like you're saying, sort of really communicate with them and discuss it with them as well.
Yeah. And I think, partners can also kind of do a little prep work ahead of letting family know like what their partner's personality is like, or, yeah, she's from a smaller family. This is probably going to be overwhelming. Please take it easy on her. Please don't,
Yeah.
whatever. And I think, yeah, just, yeah, not having that pressure. Like it's a first meeting and then you're going to have tons of other interactions where you'll slowly build that relationship, and build that comfort level and closeness and trust and be able
Yeah.
to then come out of your shell. I don't think anyone who meets extended family members of their partners like the first time is like their total true selves. It's like,
No. Yeah.
it's kind of a performance a little bit. And so, yeah, but and just take deep breaths. It will go well. I
Yeah.
promise.
Well, thank you for being the therapist for a few minutes and helping me out there. Now, this slides on smoothly with the next part of the show, which is the practice and habits. Now, this is a recommendation that you give for a lot of families who are going through extended families. So, what would you recommend families to effectively enhance the involvement of extended families?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think one is kind of calibrating expectations of like what can we expect from one another. And again, like in an ideal world, we'd be able to communicate this. And I think, in some instances we can say it's,
Yeah.
parents to their own parents who are becoming new grandparents. we can kind of maybe communicate, hey, this is, I don't want parenting advice unless I ask for parenting advice.
Yeah.
I don't want anybody in the delivery room, besides my partner, when we do this. So I think we can kind of figure out what our expectations are, or even asking, like, what are your expectations as a grandparent? Like, how involved do you want to be in in your grandchild's life? Do you want to like babysit? Do you want to just kind of see them, in supervised settings, and so both people kind of aren't disappointed with that. Kind of going with that grandparent example, like I think sometimes adult children think, oh, grandparents, they're going to drop everything and their world's just going to revolve around us.
Yeah.
And that's great if, that's what they want. But then grandparents might be like, oh, I'm finally retired. I get to go do all of the things I couldn't do while I worked and had kids. And if there was no communication about that, there could be a lot of resentments. Like the adult children can feel like, oh, you don't want to be involved in our lives. You're not supporting me. Where the grandparent might think, well, I raised my kids. I did the thing, I'm happy to be there in some capacity. And so I think, yeah, those kind of expectations, communicating that is important. I think establishing boundaries too, and again, that kind of goes along with expectations, and some boundaries we're not going to know we had until they get violated, and then communicating them, like how you said, communicating with your dad, like, please don't tell, grandma and grandpa about XYZ. You can tell them these things, but not. Or with our romantic partner, hey, please don't tell your parents, if we get in a fight, I don't want them getting involved in that. Please don't talk to your siblings about, what's going on in our relationship. Or another big topic, sometimes it's a hot button issue, is like, don't tell your family stuff that's going on in my family, because that's like,
Okay.
that's a whole set of privacy things. Like, your mom or dad don't need to know my mom's health issues, or my dad, got laid off or something like that. And
Mhm.
so I think that's something that's important. I'm sorry. And then what was just trying to get extended family members involved, you said, right?
Yes.
Sorry, I
Yeah.
like lost my train of thought with that. And I think too, then making that effort, and I think it doesn't have to be daily. It doesn't have to be constant, but like technology really does help us out now, right? We could just
Yeah.
send a quick text. It could be, a tweet or whatever they're called now that it's not Twitter. I don't know, a thing about it,
It's,
an X
I
or
don't know,
something.
an
I don't
Xing.
know.
Yeah.
Yeah. Something funny, or just a text that you're thinking of them, or if it's like grandparents, a picture of the kid doing something at an event, and so these kind of low stakes interactions, not like every interaction has to be, monumental and, really deep, just kind of those mundane connections, because that's where our relationships are rooted, right? Is in the day to day,
Yeah.
like the big, grand gestures and holidays and stuff. That's nice, but it's kind of keeping up with one another in that day to day stuff. And so I think kind of making that effort, and just showing interest, sometimes folks, and I see this a lot too in in-law relationships, especially with mother-in-laws, because that stereotype is so pervasive, right? Of like a meddlesome, intrusive mother-in-law. Some mother-in-laws go to the extreme and engage in avoidance, like, because I don't want to bother them. I don't want to be seen as
Yeah.
pestering. And then that's perceived as like, well, your mom doesn't care about us and what we're up to. So, I
Mhm.
mean, mother-in-laws, as we can see, are really damned if they do, damned if they don't
Yeah.
in general. But I think showing interest, in what someone's doing, asking how they are, making sure that relationship's not one-sided. If you're asking for support, whether it's like instrumental support, like having someone, babysit or help you move or something, giving something back as well, not
Mhm.
just, having a take of that. But I think, really, yeah, clear expectations, boundaries, and then just kind of showing up for each other and being there and doing the work of
Mhm.
being family. I think a lot of us that maybe either are or have experienced, families who talk about how close they are and, oh, we're such a tight knit family, but like they're nowhere to be found when, things get rough,
Yeah.
or they're not involved in the day to day. And it's like, well, you say we're close, but you're not doing the things that
Yeah.
would show me that we're close.
Exactly.
So I think, yeah, showing up and like doing the work.
So a lot of it is about communicating with each member of the family and sort of setting those boundaries in a way. Like I know there are a lot of my friends whose in-laws are very much like, oh, there's no boundary between us. There's no limit. And I've spoken to a lot of my friends about that. How because for people who don't really believe in boundaries, especially like older generations who are sort of just like, well, you have to be respectful, or like cultural settings where you have to be respectful and treat your grandparents and parents with such respect that you sort of belittle yourself in the process. How do you have the balance between the two where you're not feeling you're disrupting your life, but you're also still there for them? You're also still able to communicate with them in a way that is best for you.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good kind of point you bring up is like, especially with in-law relationships, there's a lot of, ethnic and racial cultural expectations on that of
Yeah.
like, yes, either being really deferential, like, in the US, it's kind of more like courtship and marriage like takes place separate from our family of origins. And then we start this new unit and we kind of, can be an island on our own and not, bring people in too much.
Mhm.
And then in other cultures, I know, yeah, it's accepted to be or expected to be like deferential to the mother in law. The mother in law is still kind of the matriarch. And even then the daughter in law, listens to the mother in law and kind of, has to, obey what the mother in law does. So I think in those instances, it is tricky because you have these cultural scripts you have to uphold. And what I think is interesting too is like just because this is like written in the script in the culture doesn't mean you have to be okay with it
Mhm.
either, because I know of research that's like, and, I think it's Chinese culture and there's like a lot of, really being deferential to the in laws. But it's not that these, Chinese daughter in laws are like, yeah, I'm totally cool with that. They just still don't like it, but you kind of have to acquiesce to it, right?
Yep.
And so I think in cases like that, it's really just trying to find the balance, if you can, of what pieces of yourself or information about yourself can you give that, I forget there's some researchy term for it and I can't remember what it is, but it's like, it feels like we're sharing a lot and doing a lot, but we're
Okay.
not?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's kind of like this faux disclosure or faux involvement? So maybe it's like the low stakes things
Mhm.
that you don't mind them knowing. Sure, we could share, we're looking into buying a new car. That's not super heavy and emotional.
Yep.
But then other things keeping for yourself. And I think it gets especially tricky when you have folks from other cultures, you have intercultural marriages and relationships, navigating that balance too.
Mhm. So it's very much like you're playing a character in front of them a
Kind
little
of.
bit. Mhm.
I mean, and yeah, ideally that wouldn't be, but if that's kind of what the cultural script necessitates, there has to be some kind of like self preservation with that.
Yep.
Um, and knowing like, yes, you're fulfilling your role because that role is really important in your culture, to do that and uphold those expectations. But then I could still be me and, myself in my relationship. And we still have boundaries, even though my in laws might not think that we have boundaries because
Yeah.
I'm
So sort
pretending
of
that we
like
don't.
sneaking it in, like slightly
Kind
being
of.
like, okay, I'm setting that boundary, but I'm not telling them. Like they know all
Right.
about me, but they don't know anything at all.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that could work. Yeah.
Yeah. We need examples, like list of examples of that as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
So this slides us really well into the open mic section of the show. Now, this gives you a chance to talk about anything you're passionate about, or maybe something that you want to speak upon that we didn't really get to throughout the show. So, in the last minute or so, I'd love to give you the floor and just share what's on your mind with us today.
Yeah. I think the biggest things, yeah, like I said, I'm in the process of writing more of a pop culture book on my in-law relationship research, but taking this feminist perspective. I call it feminist in-lawing, in a way to kind of, flip the script and kind of, make things different from mothers-in-law and daughter-in-laws and couples, to kind of have that agency, rethink each of their roles in this dynamic. And so we're coming into these relationships with more kind of positive expectations,
Mhm.
versus negative expectations that are so gendered. And so, yeah, I write about this. I have a blog for Psychology Today called Communicating Through Change. And so I write on these topics. And then, yeah, folks want to follow me on social media so I can get those numbers up. I'm at Dr. Sylvia Mikucki-Enyart on Instagram and TikTok. I answer questions that folks, send in to me or, DM me on those, and usually create, like videos and slides to really answer big questions, little questions, and just really help folks navigate in-law relationships and broader extended family relationships.
Oh, that's perfect. Thank you so much for sharing that. I'll definitely have all of those links down below for anyone who wants to access them and hopefully find out. I read the Enough with the Toxic In-Law article, and that really got my blood boiling as well as to how we sort of perceive that. And we did talk about that. So if you want to find out a little bit more of the other articles that Sylvia has definitely written, then yeah, go check out Psychology Today and with her blog as well. Thank you so much, Sylvia, for joining me on the show
Yes.
today and for being my therapist for the day and some ideas.
Yes, anytime. Thanks so much for having me.
I hope you guys learned as much as I did, and I'm pretty sure I learned a lot and can calm down a little bit more now. I'll see you all in the next episode. You've been listening to All Together, the Family Science Insights podcast, produced by the Family Science Labs, a division of LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. More episodes are available from 10 life management perspectives and can be found by searching LMSL on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and other podcasting apps available on your devices. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider rating our show, sharing it, and subscribing to our channel, as it helps other people find it so that we can grow and bring you more quality resources. More of our work can be found on our website at fa.lmsl.net, where you can join our movement. I'm Dina Sargeant. Thanks for tuning in.